This interview will be focused on your professional and personal relationship with the great 20th century thinker Isaiah Berlin. But before we begin to talk about that relationship, it might be helpful if you could tell us what Isaiah Berlin and you yourself were doing before your paths crossed. So can you start by giving us a sense of who Isaiah Berlin was and how he had become such a renowned figure by the time you met him in 1972?
Isaiah was born in 1909 in Riga, which is now the capital of Latvia, but was then the capital of Livonia, which is roughly the same area, and was a province of the Russian Empire, so he was born in Tsarist Russia. And he was the son of a reasonably wealthy Jewish entrepreneur who was in the timber business and was part of a family with a long tradition of owning forests in the interior of Russia, felling the timber and bringing them down the river Daugava to Riga, where they were sawn up and then sent on to various different destinations. So the supply of sleepers to the Russian railways was the main part of the business. Because they were well-to-do bourgeois Jews, they were not confined to the ghetto area of the city, but lived in a prosperous suburb street called Albert Street, in a nice flat. And that was where they were for the first 6 years of Isaiah's life. But then, as the First World War arrived and the German army was getting closer and closer to Riga, they decided that for the safety of the family, they would decamp to Russia proper, and the first thing they did was go to a little town called Andriopol in the interior, which was like a small town or large village, which was in the center of the forested area, where Isaiah's father, Mendel Berlin, had an office. And there they were for about a year, and after that they moved on to St. Petersburg, which was called Petrograd at the time, where there was a bigger office of the business. And they were there in Petersburg when the Russian Revolution occurred. So Isaiah actually witnessed both Russian revolutions, the Social Democratic one in February and the Bolshevik one in October. And they were there for another 2 or 3 years, and the life under the Bolsheviks was pretty oppressive, and there was a certain amount of anti-Semitism. And by that time, by 1920, Latvia had gained its independence, and a treaty after the First World War, and a treaty was agreed that anybody who was born in Latvia could return to Latvia automatically without having to get permission. And that's what they took advantage of. So they went back to Latvia in 1920. And there was further difficulties there, some of an anti-Semitic kind, which determined Mendel to emigrate to England, which the family did in early 1921. Mendel already had extensive business interests in Britain, and he had deposited a large sum of money in a British bank, so he was well set up to make that move. And Isaiah went to an English prep school for a year, learnt English quite quickly, and then went to St. Paul's School, which was one of the leading English public schools, which of course means private schools. He was moderately successful there, more successful than he admitted, but he wasn't an absolutely runaway star pupil. Nevertheless, he did get into Oxford. He tried first to get into Balliol for a scholarship, failed, tried again to get in as a commoner, failed, and then turned to Corpus Christi College, the smallest college in Oxford, where he got a scholarship to read Greats, which is the classics, ancient history and philosophy mixture, which was probably the leading school to read in those days. And then that's when his academic success really took off in a big way. He got a first in grades. He then decided to read PPE, which is Philosophy, Politics and Economics. And he did that in a year flat and got a first in that too. Was joint winner of the John Locke Prize in Philosophy, which is an independent exam for philosophers. So he was obviously very good at philosophy. And shortly afterwards, shortly after getting his first in PPE, he got into All Souls. There's a fellowship examination, which is famously fiendishly difficult. And he sat that in November, I think, 1932. And to his astonishment, was accepted. He was the first Jew ever to be elected to that kind of post in All Souls, in fact, to any post in All Souls. So he made history in that way, and there was an article in the Jewish Chronicle and all that kind of thing. His star rose and rose in the academic world from that time onwards. He was a Fellow of All Souls for, I think the fellowship was 7 years, and he left after 6 because he'd finished his project, which was to write a biography of Karl Marx. That was his first published book, probably his only proper book that he ever wrote, which was commissioned by the Home University Library, which was a kind of series of guides for the graduate housewife, as we used to say at Oxford University Press, to different topics. And obviously Karl Marx was an important topic, and that's what he wrote about. He wasn't the first choice for the job. Several other distinguished people were asked and declined. And so the editors decided to take a punt on Isaiah, who was rather an unknown quantity. But I think their choice turned out to be justified. He wrote a brilliant book on Marx, which is still in print now, 80-something years later, and now in its 5th edition. In 1938, a year before the expiry of his fellowship at All Souls, he moved to New College, where he was already working as a lecturer, had done, in fact, since the beginning of his time in All Souls, and became a tutor in philosophy there, teaching undergraduates several hours a week. And that took him up to the beginning of the war. In the war, he made a very strange journey to America with Guy Burgess. The idea was, the basis for this was his desire to return to Russia. He wanted to go back to Russia partly for sentimental reasons, I think, but also he hoped that he could be of some help to the war effort because of his totally fluent Russian. Russian was his native language. But it was problematic to get there, and he made various approaches which didn't bear fruit. And then one day, suddenly, Guy Burgess, who knew about this intention of his, turned up and suggested that they go to Russia together. He said he'd fixed something. It's all very obscure, and we don't have time in this interview to go into all of that. But the long and the short of it is that in July 1940, he set sail with Burgess for America, which was the route that they intended to take to Russia, across America and then across to Russia from the east. And when he got to America, the plans that he had to go on to Russia turned out to fail, again for complicated reasons. But he was picked up by an institution called British Information Services, which was based in New York, which did surveys of American newspapers and public opinion and reported them back to the British government in an attempt to draw America into the war. America was at that time not willing to join in, as you know, and indeed the entry of America into the war waited until Pearl Harbor, when all the efforts of the information services became irrelevant. That was overshadowed by Pearl Harbor. And then, after that, he was moved to the British Embassy in Washington, where, again, they were sending information about American political opinion back to Britain. And he was charged with the permanent surveying of American opinion, which suited him very well because he was a fantastic gossip and loved mixing in all sorts of different circles. And every week he would draft a summary of what was going on, which was formally submitted to the British government by the American ambassador, by the British ambassador to Washington at the time, Lord Halifax. But they were effectively written by Isaiah, and they've been published subsequently, or a selection of them have been published in a book called Washington Dispatches. That took him right through the war. And then he tried again at the end of the war, after the war had formally ended, to go to Russia, and this time he succeeded. He was sent to Russia by his bosses in Washington, ostensibly to do a similar operation in Moscow, to report on Russian opinion, both in the government and among the people at large, with a view to throwing light on their foreign policy. In fact, he never wrote a report on their foreign policy. I don't know how he got away with not doing what he was sent there to do, but he did. Instead, he wrote a report on the state of culture in Russia. And this was based on a whole range of meetings that he had with writers, artists of all kinds in Russia when he was there. How useful it was to the British government, I don't know, but it did have a few political remarks in it, but it's a wonderful piece. It's a wonderful survey of the state of Russian culture under the totalitarian Soviet regime. And his main informants were two very famous poets, Boris Pasternak and Anna Akhmatova. He met Pasternak in his writer's village of Peredelkino several times and got to know him really well, and to the point where Pasternak gave him part of Dr. Zhivago, which he was then working on, to read, and I'm not sure whether he brought it home, but he certainly read it overnight and was absolutely blown away by it. And then in November of 1940, this visit ran from September 1945 to January 1946, this Russian trip. And in November, he made a trip to what was now called Leningrad, St. Petersburg again, under its new name. And he wanted to visit where he had lived as a child, and he was very moved by doing so. When he was there, he went to a famous bookshop called the Writers' Bookshop on the Nevsky Prospect, where writers tended to gather to talk and indulge in his usual fluent gossip technique, and picked up that Akhmatova, one of the most famous living Russian poets, lived just round the corner on the Fontanka Canal. And the bookshop owner rang her up and arranged for them to meet. So he went round to see her, and that was the beginning of a long, long session, one of many. The first one lasted from 3 o'clock in the afternoon, only for half an hour or so, because it was interrupted. But then he came back again at 9 in the evening and stayed right through the night till 11 o'clock the following morning. And they had a most amazing discussion, and they had a terrific rapport. They got on really well. He said too well. I never quite understood what too well means, but that's what he said. And when he returned finally to the Astoria Hotel where he was staying the next morning, his companion, who'd travelled to Leningrad with him, a British council lady called Brenda Tripp, saw him throw himself on his bed and declare, "I am in love, I am in love." People always think that they must have had a physical relationship or encounter on that occasion, but he always said, and I believe him, that nothing could be further from the truth. They sat in opposite corners of the room, and they just talked and talked and talked. And they covered everything, their personal lives, they covered literature, they covered Soviet politics. It was, for them, both of them, it was a really important meeting that was a presence in their lives ever after. And Akhmatova wrote several wonderful poems which are inspired by their meeting. And eventually in 1980, after rather a long delay, Isaiah wrote a written account of the meetings, which is widely agreed to be one of his most powerful and moving essays, which was published in a collection of pieces about individuals he knew called Personal Impressions in 1980, as I say. Well, that takes us through the war, and we then come to his return to Oxford in 1946, back to New College, where he remained until 1950, getting more and more frustrated by the limitations of the job he had, the teaching of undergraduates and the very dull senior common room at New College as he saw it. And then he applied for another post at All Souls, a research fellowship, which he got, and the idea was to turn to the study of the history of ideas, in particular Russian ideas of the mid-19th century, yes, the Russian intelligentsia in those years. And so he was there from 1950, and in 1957 he was appointed to the Chichely Chair of Social and Political Theory, which is based in All Souls, so that didn't take him away from All Souls. And then that was when he gave his famous inaugural lecture, Two Concepts of Liberty. That's 1958, which is probably the most famous, or one of the two most famous essays he wrote, the other being The Hedgehog and the Fox, which was written during his time as a research fellow at All Souls, part of his Russian activities, if you like. So in 1965, he was approached by a group of people who knew him to become the first president of a new graduate college which was being founded. It was being founded on a fairly modest scale in a house in a village in the suburbs of Oxford called Iffley, and was called Iffley College to start with. He wanted to enlarge it and make it a more important presence in the Oxford scene, and he realized that in order to do this he would need to raise large sums of money, which was not something he'd ever done before, but he set to it with a will and turned out to have a great talent for this, as well as great contacts which were of use to him. The two contacts which were important were Sir Isaac Wolfson, who was in charge of the Wolfson Foundation, based on the wholesale grocery operation called Great Universal Stores, a great Jewish philanthropist, and he hit it off with him. And he also knew George Bundy, who worked for the Ford Foundation in America. Anyway, long story short, both those organizations committed large sums of money to the new college, which was then launched, named Wolfson College after one of its donors, in 1966, in June 1966 that began, and he was the first president, a post that he held for 9 years till 1975.
Could you tell us how you first encountered Isaiah Berlin?
I had come up to read greats at Corpus Christi College as an undergraduate in 1967. And it turned out later, of course, that was Isaiah's college, although I didn't know that at the time, nor did I know about him. Don't think I'd even heard of him. I didn't see that course through to the end. After the first part of the course, I switched to PPP, which is Philosophy, Psychology and Physiology, of which you do two. I left out the physiology. And after that, I became very interested, absorbed, intrigued by philosophy, and wanted to go on, in particular, to spend some time thinking harder about a particular part of the philosophy of Wittgenstein. And so I decided that I wanted to do graduate work in philosophy. So I applied to various colleges which were offering graduate scholarships to people who were going to do the B.Phil. Was happily turned down by them all until I got to Wolfson, where I was accepted. And that's where I first met Berlin, because he was the chair of the interviewing panel for this graduate award. And I was immediately incredibly struck by him and excited by his personality and his presence. And after arriving at the college, fortunately, I found that he was immensely accessible. He sat around in the common room for hours. He wasn't like one of these apparatchiks who disappears to a committee meeting immediately after downing his coffee. Sometimes he would sit there from lunch until dinner, and anybody who wanted to could sit and talk to him, or more like listen to him talk, because he was a great talker and not a fantastic listener at all times, which didn't matter because he talked so wonderfully that one didn't resent it. Anyway, I got to know him, and I asked a philosopher friend that I'd made at the college, a man called Samuel Guttenplan, who had worked with Berlin in New York in the 1960s as his research assistant when he had a professorship at the City University there, and knew him very well. I said, what has he written? What should I read to find out what his ideas are? And he referred me to 4 essays on liberty, which was a collection of independently published essays which had been put together for a book and published by OUP in 1969, so that was 3 years previously. So it was quite a fresh book at that time. And I took it away with me on a holiday with some friends, including Sam, and I read it, and I was completely knocked sideways by it. I thought it was the most wonderful book, which was full of wisdom. And this gave me an intense interest in following his ideas further. And so I discussed them further with Sam, and I suppose it was at this point that the idea occurred that somebody needed to rescue more of his work and put it together, because he'd published very widely, but often in obscure places or foreign periodicals or pamphlets or things of that kind. There were no proper, apart from Karl Marx, which was published in 1939. There was nothing that was, there was The Hedgehog and the Fox, admittedly, which was published in 1953, and then there were 4 essays on liberty. But there was a terrific scope for more to be done. And I entered into negotiations with Berlin with that in view. Having become aware of how much he had published, although I still was very poor on the specifics, I was just given a general idea by conversation or in conversation that there was a lot out there. So I started talking to Berlin about it. And he was hesitant and he blew hot and cold. But he was very loyal to the students at Wolfson. He would support them in whatever they wanted to do. And just because what I wanted to do involved him, that didn't make this an exception. And I think that was part of the reason why he did eventually agree that I could do this, even though various other people had approached him previously and had either been turned down or had been accepted, and then he'd changed his mind or whatever. So I did then formulate a scheme, a detailed scheme, which involved going to the Oxford University Library and digging out everything I could find that he'd written, and grouping the items that I discovered into subject categories, potential volumes, of which there were 4. So from that point onwards, that was something I was working on, first of all in parallel with my graduate work in philosophy for the first year or 2, and then when that was finished and I went into publishing, I continued with that as my hobby for the next, I suppose, 15 years, because I was an editor at OUP till 1990. One of them already existed in a rather shadowy way. That's Russian Thinkers, which was under the editorship of a Russianist called David Shapiro from, I think, Essex. And for some reason which I don't understand, Shapiro, who had, like me, achieved an agreement with Berlin to allow him to edit a volume, appeared to be doing nothing about it. So eventually that was absorbed into my scheme. So that was, as it were, a given. And I read all the other things that I could find. And that itself, it was very difficult to establish what he had written because he couldn't remember. And he had copies of some of them, but not others. There were various lists. There were entries in library catalogues. There were cuttings from Durrant's press cuttings agency had sent some reviews. It was like a detective job, tracking them all down. And one of the first things I did, in fact, was to publish a bibliography of his writings. I published it in the college magazine at Wolfson, which I also founded, as it happened, because I liked running magazines. But it was very immediately clear to me that the other essays, the ones that weren't in the Russian volume, fell into three clear categories. One was the essays on people he had known, 20th century figures, scholars, statesmen, intellectuals, and that was what eventually appeared as personal impressions. He doesn't actually know all of them. He never met Roosevelt, who's one of the characters, and he knew the others, some of the others slightly. But by and large, the topics of that volume were people he knew well. Then there were some philosophical essays, which came mainly from the earlier period of his life before he had made a switch from philosophy to the history of ideas, which we probably need to talk about separately. So some of them were more or less semi-technical articles in philosophy published in philosophical journals of the kind that other people were writing at the time. They were written in the 30s up to the 50s. And also some later articles which, although they were more informed by his new perspective that had taken over by that time, were still clearly in the same category in principle. So that was a volume which turned into what was called Concepts and Categories, which was a phrase that he used a great deal, and it just leapt out at me as an obvious title for the book.
Can you talk a little about the transition between Berlin being an analytic philosopher and why he went to the history of ideas?
Yes, I think he had some reservations, perhaps serious reservations, about analytic philosophy from the beginning. His room in All Souls was the venue for a regular meeting between the younger philosophers of Oxford, including Freddie Ayer and John Austin. And they had discussions ranging over the whole range of philosophy. And I think his general approach to topics at that time might be called anti-reductionist. He thought that the analytic philosophers wanted to oversimplify everything, wanted to reduce everything to a kind of fixed formal structure, which was a terrific underrepresentation of what was really going on in human language and discussion. So he was, if you like, he was set up to make such a move, but there were two events which he talks of, which stimulated this move to actually take place. I think, though, before I get on to those, I should just say that probably working in America as an active diplomat during the war didn't hold him back either. I mean, I think that broadened his mind and matured him, and probably was an input to the decision he finally took. The first event is a meeting he had at Harvard in 1944 with H.M. Schaffer, a logician, and they talked about philosophy and its limitations and its strengths, and Schaffer managed to convince him on his account that what made philosophy distinctive was that it didn't add to the sum of human knowledge. There were certain, which you might call semi-philosophical or quasi-philosophical areas where something like growth of knowledge occurred, and the two which he mentions are psychology and logic. But in the traditional main areas of philosophy, there wasn't anything that could be described as accumulation of knowledge. You didn't talk about somebody who was knowledgeable in ethics or had added to the sum of metaphysics in the same way that you would about a scientist, for example. So he, I think, imbibed and accepted this as a characterization of what was distinctive about philosophy, and that set him up for the other event, which was when he had to travel back to the UK at one point thereafter, and he was travelling on a bomber aircraft where you sat in the dark with an oxygen mask on your face, and because the mask had to be kept in place and shouldn't be allowed to slip, you had to remain awake. You couldn't allow yourself to fall asleep. And the planes were slower in those days, and the journey time was 8 hours. And he's always said he hates having to think, which is rather a remarkable thing to say as a thinker, but he didn't like to be on his own thinking without anybody to bounce ideas off, without reading a book, without anything else going on other than the contents of his own mind. So he said he had the painful experience of having to think for 8 hours on his own. And during that flight, he claims he came to the conclusion that he did want to acquire knowledge. He wanted, as he put it, to know more at the end of his life than he knew at the beginning. And he'd already conceived a considerable interest in studying the ideas of the Russian 19th century intelligentsia, and he conceived the more general notion that what he really wanted to do was not to be doing first-order philosophy with the problem that we've identified, but to be studying the history of philosophy and the history of the people who had been philosophers and what they'd contributed. So he would end up knowing more about the history of thought in a straightforward accumulation of knowledge way at the end. If you like, I'm not sure that isn't a sort of, to some degree, a rationalization of a development that was taking place in any case, but it makes a good story.
In fact, John Gray, the great philosopher, and actually wrote a great book about Berlin, mentions, as in fact I do in my book, that really he felt that doing the history of philosophy was doing philosophy just in another way. He never really abandoned philosophy. Do you think that's correct?
I do think that's correct. I think the picture of a sharp change from one discipline to another, which he rather promulgated himself, is misleading. And I think if you read both the pre-change essays and the post-change essays, particularly some of the ones in the philosophical volume that I edited, I think you can see a clear continuity of interest. But it's just that the discussion in the later essays is more historically placed, more historically informed, and for that very reason I think richer, because I think extracting something he would subscribe to is to say that extracting ideas from their historical context and presenting them as if they were free-floating in some abstract realm is unrealistic and unhelpful. So it was a richer form of philosophy, if you like. And then the last category was the history of ideas, which was essentially studies of individual thinkers in the history of ideas, mainly in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And they were remarkable because they displayed his fantastic ability, I've never seen matched, to get inside the mind and under the skin of a person who could be very, very different from him, have a very different outlook on life, but somehow he brought them to life and managed to almost speak through their mouth like a ventriloquist. And this was very much, and one of the common themes of these essays was that these people were not just remarkable thinkers, but they had left a deposit in the mind of humanity, if you like. They'd changed the direction of human thinking. They had left a legacy in the mental furniture that we all enjoy. And that's why I called the book Against the Current, because not only did they have this creative ability to infuse new intellectual content into our storehouse, but they did it against the orthodoxy of the day. They were able to start off journeys in completely new directions, and that's, of course, part of what made them so exciting. So that was the volume of the History of Ideas. So that left me with 4 volumes, which, with a certain amount of coming and going and changing of heart and adjusting of content, is how things stayed. And they were published eventually between 1978 and 1980.
And did you encounter any resistance from Isaiah in the publication of these, or was it a smooth?
Far from smooth. The worst example of his weakness of will, or whatever you like to call it, was that after having agreed to and signed up to the 4-volume scheme, he suddenly got cold feet about the philosophy volume. He thought that too many of the articles were dated, no longer of any particular interest, and that they would attract negative commentary from critics. He claimed that he wasn't worried about negative comment from critics, and that it was just that he didn't want to visit upon the world something which wasn't worth publishing in volume form. But I believe that, in fact, he was always very moved by the thought of harsh comment, and didn't want to expose himself to it when he didn't have to. At any rate, he wrote to me out of the blue and told me that he suddenly decided he didn't want this book to appear at all. This made me very downhearted, and I had a long argument with him in letter form about it. And in the end, we agreed to submit the idea to the arbitration of his friend Bernard Williams, who was a great philosopher and somebody whose judgment he respected more than he respected mine, which is to say, in the latter case, not at all, probably. Anyway, I'm happy to say that Bernard, who later had quite negative views about some of the volumes I produced, in this case was in favour of it, and wrote a strong letter to Isaiah arguing its merits, with the exception of one of the essays I'd planned to include, which was very closely bound up with an essay he was replying to by another philosopher, and so didn't stand independently quite so well. And so he changed his mind back again, saying to me, "So I am made of wax after all." And that book was the second to be published after Russian Thinkers.
So after a very busy, frenetic period of getting these 4 collected volumes together, you then enter the 1980s, which from a publication point of view becomes, as you say, quite a fallow period. It became a very interesting period as your time as editor in Oxford University Press. And I'm referring in particular to the series The Past Masters. Can you tell us a little bit about the origins of what lay behind the Past Masters series and your role in instigating it?
Yes, I was working from 1977. In 1977, I joined the General Books Department, as it was called, in Oxford University Press, which was a department aimed at publishing high-quality books about serious subjects, but ones aimed at a general readership as much as an academic readership. And I had the idea, which arose directly out of my work on and with Isaiah, that we might issue a series of short, 100-page long, perhaps, guides to the ideas of these individuals who, as I said earlier, had made really creative contributions to human thought, which explained what their ideas were, why they were different from what went before, how they had changed the way people think, and how they remain, in some sense, part of our mental structures even today. And this was accepted by Oxford University Press, and that was the Past Masters series, which began publication in 1980. And we began with 6 volumes in the first season, and followed up in subsequent seasons with 2, 3, 4 books, depending on what was available. And in the end, the series was quite numerous. I can't remember the number, but it would be around about 100 perhaps. And ultimately, the series was further widened to include topics as well as people, and was renamed the Very Short Introduction series, and that today is one of OUP's flagship series, and you will find in it a large number of books which began their lives as past masters. So I'm pleased and proud about that, although I wasn't involved in the series by the time it became a Very Short Introductions.
One of the assumptions underlying the past masters, which then, as you say, became Very Short Introductions, was that the ideas of the great thinkers are not exhausted by the particular context from which they emerge. And this is very much Isaiah Berlin's view of the history of ideas. Can you say something about that?
Yes. Isaiah felt very strongly that the only real point in studying the figures of the past, well, I won't say the only point. Of course, there is a purely historical way of studying them, which is of interest to historians and antiquarians of various kinds. But what made these figures intensely interesting to him and of potential interest to a wide readership was that they grappled with issues and made contributions to issues which are of permanent interest to any thoughtful human being. And of course, this works against the attitude of another way of doing the history of ideas, which is sometimes called the Cambridge School or the contextual school, which places the thought and discussions of past thinkers very much in the context of their own time, and tries to convince us that we're guilty of anachronism if we speak to these people across time as if they were in the same room with us and started from the same assumptions, and we could talk to them straightforwardly without complication, as if we were speaking the same language. And Berlin certainly recognized that there was some truth in that, and he didn't want to be anachronistic, but he thought that even when you had made due allowance for the difference in context, as between thinkers of the past and us today, there was still a residue of universal interest, and that was what made studying these people valuable and important. And if it hadn't been so, then, as I said before, although there would have been antiquarian interest in these people, they would have been of no interest to a general reader. And he made this point with particular force about a thinker he was interested in called Giambattista Vico, a Neapolitan thinker of great originality in his view. And somebody called Peter Burke had written for Past Masters, hadn't written, I think he'd written a proposal which made clear the line he was going to take. And this synopsis or of the book made clear that he wasn't going to talk in the way that Berlin would have wanted him to talk. He was going to talk about how all his ideas and thoughts were part of the intellectual world of his time and were bound by that and didn't translate or transfer into our own preoccupations and worries. And Berlin said, well, if that's true, why do we bother to study him? And indeed, in writing to Quentin Skinner, who's possibly the leading figure in the Cambridge School about this topic, he was quite firm in saying it was the things that are it was the issues that are still alive today that made him interested in these figures from the past, and without that, the whole thing would fall apart.
Towards the end of the 1980s, you came up with the idea, and indeed the title of a new book of Isaiah Berlin's writings. I'm of course referring to The Crooked Timber of Humanity. Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful title. Can you say something about its origins?
The title comes from a quotation from Kant, which Isaiah loved. It was one of his favourite quotations, which says, "Out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made." And that had always seemed to me a wonderful quotation, and well, the title sort of chose itself in a way. And for once, Berlin accepted it initially positively and never repined, so it must have had something. It was published almost exactly at the time that I left OUP to start full-time work on Berlin's papers.
In that collection, you have that great essay, The Pursuit of the Ideal, mm-hmm. which is a very eloquent summary, really, of Berlin's credo. Mm-hmm. So can you at this point tell us a little bit about what Berlin's credo was, with the emphasis on his pluralism?
Mm. Yes, he presents himself in that essay as having initially been a believer in what he calls monism, which he identifies with a current in Western thought that goes back at least as far as the ancient Greeks and comes right up to the present, which he always characterizes in terms of three propositions, which he sometimes describes as a three-legged stool. They vary a bit, and sometimes some of them are quite different, but essentially they are that any genuine question must have an answer, including questions of morals and politics. I should perhaps preface this by saying that for him, those were the questions that exercised him, that brought him alive. What the really deep questions about human life, like what should we do, how should we live, what can we be and do, what are the opportunities open to us, how should we use our lives in the world, those sorts of very deep moral questions. And so to go back to the three-legged stool, the first proposition was that such questions must have answers, just as scientific questions or other kinds of questions have answers. The second proposition was that there must be a way of discovering these answers. There are various candidates proposed, like scripture or experiment or the simple heart of the uncorrupted peasant or whatever, or our own inner feelings. A whole range of possibilities are canvassed, but in principle there must be some way of finding an answer to these questions. And the third and last leg is the claim that if these questions are correct and right and true, then they must all fit together in a consistent structure and make sense. So that there must be a single architecture of answers to all kinds of questions, none of which contradict each other, because no true things can contradict each other, because that's just not the way truth works. And that is monism, or sometimes referred to him as the Philosophia Perennis, which is the perennial philosophy, and he identifies it as being dominant in philosophical thought for at least 2,000 years. I've always had a problem with it myself because it seems so obviously wrong. It's an example of how philosophers come up with things which create problems, which if they just had been ordinary people and not gone off on these flights of intellectual fancy, wouldn't have troubled us in the way that they have. But people seem influenced by by such things. People are ready to be influenced by such theories, and particularly in the world of religion, perhaps. Christianity turned into a system rather of that kind. Islam is today a system of rather of that kind. So there are religious versions of it. There are also non-religious, political versions of it, totalitarian versions like the Soviet Union in particular, maybe to some extent existing communist societies today, China and others, where the underlying assumption of the rule imposed by the political leaders or the religious leaders or whichever leaders are involved is that there is a true structure of moral and political understanding which experts can discover and then impose on the people beneath them. Some form of authoritarianism or tyranny or totalitarianism, some oppressive monist ideology which constrains and restricts people's freedom to take their own path, to develop in unpredictable directions. And that's something which Berlin always had the greatest regret about, because he thought it flew in the face of our true natures.
He raises a question mark about the truth of, as you say, monism, or he sometimes calls the Ionian fallacy.
Yep.
And those who have questioned that idea have tended to actually largely become nihilists. He doesn't become a nihilist. He becomes what he calls a pluralist. So the absence of monism he doesn't think necessarily leads to nihilism.
No.
Can you say a little bit about what he means by pluralism?
Yes, pluralism is what he regards as a truer account of human moral, political behavior, and it says that there are a large number of goals that we pursue, or ends that we aim at, or values that we are guided by, which are generated, if you like, by human nature, by the shared nature that all human beings have had from the beginning of time until now. And they include really basic biological things like the need for food and drink and shelter and social membership. But they also extend into more abstract values like liberty and equality and dignity and so forth. And the important thing about pluralism is that these values don't all cohere into this single consistent structure that I was talking about before, but that they are distinct from one another in irreducible ways. That's to say, you can't translate them all into one super value or examples of one super value, as the utilitarians tried to do by, as it were, giving marks to each value in terms of its ability to cause happiness in human beings, so that you could then add up the various values and work out what the best thing to do in any given situation was. So the demands that are made of us by the desire for equality are distinct from the demands made by the desire for liberty, and they are what he called incommensurable. Let's say you can't measure them together on a single scale, which is what I was just saying about utility. You can't reduce or translate them into one super value, and so there are endless choices to be made between all these different values, because each is making its own distinctive demands, and you have to balance one against the other and achieve a compromise between them, which is a matter of judgment and not a matter of calculation. That's the starting point for pluralism.
So is he saying that you can have moral objectivity without moral agreement?
Absolutely, yes. He sometimes calls his position objective pluralism. it's not perhaps 100% clear what this objectivity consists in, but I think we can probably usefully define it in terms of, again, of human nature. There are certain natural objectives which human beings aim at because of the kind of beings that they are. And these are plural and sometimes in conflict with one another. So, one person may give a higher value to one as opposed to another in one situation, whereas somebody else in the same situation would make the choice differently. And at a more macro level, a given culture will come up with a package of values which identify that culture, which is very different from the package of values adopted by another culture. And there is, if you like, they're all right answers to the questions, the deep questions which I referred to earlier of how to live, how to structure society. But it isn't that one is better than another, or one is right and another is wrong. They're all right. It's the conflict of right with right, as I think Hegel once said. So my particular assemblage of values and my prioritizing of values is mine and yours is yours, and there's no saying that one is superior to the other, and the same goes for different cultures. So as you rightly say, there's objectivity in that all the values and all the assemblages of values respond to recognizable features of human nature, recognizable human needs. But there isn't moral agreement because they're not. There's no way of saying that one decision, one way of forming a culture is better than another. They're just different options available to us.
And this, therefore, sets up a very profound connection between pluralism and liberalism, which before Berlin wasn't very clear. So his pluralism leads to a very interesting justification of liberalism.
It does, in my view, and it seems in yours. There's a terrifically large literature in philosophical journals and so forth, arguing the toss about this. Some people saying that pluralism does lead to or justify liberalism, others saying that it doesn't, or indeed, some cases, tends in exactly the opposite direction. But I think it is clear that there is that link, because if it's right that you can't put different moral worldviews in an order of priority, different cultures in an order of priority, then it's not. There's no justification for any one person or one political order to impose their own vision on everybody else, because it's arbitrary to choose that vision rather than another vision. And if there's no justification for that kind of authoritarianism, then the alternative is liberalism, which is to allow everybody to pursue their own particular arrangements of values, so long as they don't do unacceptable harm to other people, which is the essential principle of liberalism.
As you say, around the time you published The Crooked Timber of Humanity, you left OUP and you became a full-time editor, really, for Isaiah.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about, I think it was The Mages of the North was your next kind of project, but that was a very significant move. Can you tell us about that book and then what that led to then, following that?
My first task when I had left OUP was to examine all of Berlin's papers in order to see what my job as his literary executor effectively was going to be. I was one of 4 literary executors, but it was clear that I was going to be the one who actually did the legwork, and the others were going to be more in a kind of benedictive or administrative capacity. So, with his approval, I conducted a top-to-bottom search of his house, starting in the attic and ending in the cellar. Most of the stuff was in the cellar. And in the cellar, among a great deal else, I saw on the top shelf of a little wooden bookshelf a brown envelope. on which appeared the word Hartmann. And I opened the envelope, and in it I found a whole series of red plastic belts. That's what they're technically called. They are continuous strips of red plastic which had on them grooves of exactly the same kind that you see on an LP. You can see where sound has been laid down. I'd never heard of this technology at the time. Apparently it was widely used by people who had secretaries in the 50s and 60s. And I subsequently discovered that it was indeed organized by the Dictaphone company, and that you had a machine with a microphone, and you laid down the recording on these plastic discs with belts with a stylus, and then that was played back by the secretary and typed up. Each belt lasted for 15 minutes.
It may be that others are interested in the facts for their own sake, to satisfy their curiosity, semicolon, and invent or study sciences in order to satisfy the same curiosity.
But it turned out that they did contain the missing portion of the book or the essay on Hartmann, which was much longer and more important to the book than I had recognized. There was a whole chapter and a very large part of another one, and that made it possible ultimately to complete the book, which was then published in 1993, 3 years later, as The Makers of the North, subtitled J.G. Hartmann and the Origins of Modern Irrationalism. And that was well reviewed, widely reviewed. I mean, no book on that subject by anybody else would have been even taken notice of, but because it was written by Berlin in his inimitable style, it was very successful, and eventually became part of a book called Three Critics of the Enlightenment, which brought back into being a project that he'd originally had to have a book of essays on principal anti-Enlightenment figures.
It's interesting that, isn't it? I mean, Berlin was a writer that more often than not went back to the anti-Enlightenment thinkers as opposed to the Enlightenment thinkers for insights, even though he had a lot of sympathy, and maybe you could say fundamental sympathy with the Enlightenment.
Yes, he always said that he found it much more interesting reading the work of enemies rather than friends, because friends said things that you agreed with, and it was boring just to have them restated. The self-reinforcing ideas, which is what happens on, say, social media today, where people just get fed their own opinions again and again, and makes them more and more prejudiced in the direction they were originally prejudiced. But if you read the work of the opponents, you may strongly disagree with them at some fundamental level, but they do manage to identify weaknesses in the structure that you support. They reveal chinks in your armour which need attention, which need stopping up, and they enable you to strengthen your own views in ways that make them more immune to this kind of criticism. So that's why he really liked to study those kinds of thinkers.
In the early 90s, you started collecting essays that would end up being published about a year before Berlin died. Yet again, you had to deal with his resistance to having the book, The Sense of Reality, seeing the light of day, but thankfully it did. Is there anything you would like to say in particular about this book?
Yes, it's in many ways the book that is closest to my heart, because it emerged out of that initial search of his house for material that hadn't been made public before. The volume, The Sense of Reality, takes its title from a talk which he prepared for an American conference, and I thought it was wonderful. I thought it was one of the best essays of his that I'd read. And indeed, it's true that it has created a kind of sub-department of Berlin studies, The Sense of Reality, and along with it an essay that covers some similar ground called Political Judgment, which was a rather new area which hadn't been in the forefront of people's attention before. But there was a long battle between me and him to get the book out, was partly based on his disinclination to read his own work, which he felt he ought to do before he allowed it to appear. He hated reading his own book. He thought what he'd written was poor stuff, not worth publishing. He did genuinely think that, I believe. So there was that kind of reluctance. There was also sheer idleness. He was an old man. He didn't see why he should be sweating away at reading and revising his work when he didn't want to, and he kept putting it off, partly appealing to the nothing again for several years argument, partly appealing to it's all second-rate argument. So I found it difficult to achieve a balance between pestering him and treating him with consideration and respect. However, it was eventually he did read through it, and he did make a number of corrections or additions, and he did eventually allow me to go ahead in 1996, which was the year before he died, and that's when the book was published. But I feel a special fondness for it because of this relationship it had to this treasure trove of papers in his house and that stage in my work as his editor. I think it's a wonderful book. I think it's full of wonderful essays. When I sent him a copy of the finished book, he said, "Thank you for the book. It looks splendid. Completely unreadable as far as I'm concerned, but never mind." Which is, of course, nonsense.
The latest edition of that book got published this year.
Yes, Princeton University Press has published new editions of all the books I published. So they're now available in a uniform series, and in each case I've been able to add extra material of one kind and another that I've discovered since, or that I had considered adding before, but Berlin hadn't been keen, or the various reasons. Anyway, there are 2 new essays in the new edition of The Sense of Reality, which I think is one of his most important volumes.
In the second half of your book, you change gear somewhat. You cease to be, if you like, Berlin's Boswell, and you become Berlin's philosophical probe, or what I sometimes call gadfly. Can you indicate what you believe is the main appeal and strengths of Isaiah Berlin's work?
What a question. He would be the best person to answer it, of course. I think it's difficult to sum up in a brief way, but I would say that his understanding of human nature, its range, its potential, the way it really works, as opposed to the way some ideologue might want it to work, the richness of human nature, the variety, the nuance, all the sort of anti-monist aspects, if you like, of human nature is second to none. His capacity that I've referred to before to convey the outlook of a thinker by speaking from within his standpoint rather than describing it from outside, which I think is again unmatched in my experience. And the fact that he does so in wonderful prose. Not all people admire his style. It has a certain 19th-century orotundity to it, long sentences, lots of subclauses. But the English is plain, it's always clear and comprehensible. There's no use of jargon, there's no unnecessary obscurity, there's no showing off. And I find it a wonderful experience to read it. And as you read it, you feel you're in the presence of somebody who really does get what it is to be a human being and the potential open to us as human beings, and who captures it in his writing and in his descriptions of the different individuals who have thought about it deeply, which I haven't found matched anywhere else. Anybody who wants to ask the deep human questions obviously is going to be interested in somebody else who has addressed himself or herself to these questions in an illuminating way. And I think there's nobody who addresses the questions better than Berlin. I mean, it's both the choice of questions and the manner of addressing them. And the choice of questions is very much against the atmosphere of the philosophical world in which you grew up, where people were arguing about pedantic points of analysis and so on, which was a very uninspiring activity. He always thought that the purpose of philosophy was to ask about the most general questions that face human beings. Why are we here? Where are we going? How should we live? What can we be and do? These questions, which were at one stage dismissed probably by philosophers as meaningless questions, or questions to which philosophy could have no answer and therefore shouldn't waste its time on. But he, along with, going back to Socrates, who did entertain exactly the same questions, he never wavered from his view that those were indeed the questions that we should be approaching as philosophers. And I think he did so in all sorts of different ways, and they're all illuminating in their own way. And I think that we leave the experience of reading him as better human beings and better understanders of human life than we went in as. And that seems to me enough of a justification for anybody to read him.
On that Socratic point, do you think Berlin would have gone along with Socrates' alleged view that the unexamined life is a life not worth living?
Yes, I suppose he would. I mean, whether he would have made it an article of faith in quite the same way that Socrates did, I somewhat doubt. I mean, I hope at any rate. I mean, I never discussed this with him directly, but it seems to me that one of the consequences of a fully pluralist understanding of human life is that you have to make room for people who are not inclined to examine life in a philosophical way. There are some people who just prefer to live in the comforting embrace of a tradition, for example, without going into questions like this. And I don't see why a pluralist should want to restrict people who live naturally in that way. Why should they? I mean, there's room for all of us in the world, is one of his quotations. There's room for you and me in this world. There's plenty of room for people who reflect and for unreflective people. And so Socrates' view seems to me to be prejudiced in favour of the intellectual, and that's unjustifiable prejudice.
Can you indicate what you feel are the main weaknesses or at least shortcomings of Berlin's thought?
Well, it may be that the main weakness is a necessary weakness, because what a lot of people would say is the weakness is that he is not a systematic thinker. He hasn't set out to build a definitive structure of ideas from which you could read out answers to political and moral questions of various kinds, where everything is coherent and everything fits in. But of course, as you will immediately see, that fact follows necessarily, in a way, from his basic pluralist outlook. I mean, if you are a pluralist, it's just, in principle, impossible for you to come up with a systematic account of everything, because there can be no such systematic account. That's to offer one would be to fly in the face of the way reality, and in particular human reality, really is. That said, and it's a very important thing to say, it's also true that he isn't careful enough to make his statements consistent with one another, to make entirely clear what he means. He's what you might call, he's not a photographic artist of thought. He's an impressionist. He's a pointillist. He's somebody who creates an impression of a mental map of somebody's mind by dabs of paint, by sort of flashes of genius, not in a way that a camera would. So it's not possible, as with an Impressionist painting, you couldn't, as it were, reconstruct a real scene from the Impressionist painting in the way that in theory you could from a photograph. So there's a latitude for interpretation when you're reading his work, which some find frustrating, and indeed there's a lot of argument in the discussion of Berlin's ideas in the literature about what he really meant by such and such, and whether this statement is consistent with that statement, and if not, why not? And what do you think would be the best view to attribute to him and the best view to discard, and so forth. So, I mean, I don't say that you can't extract something clearer and more consistent and systematic from his ideas, and indeed I think you can, and that's what I, in part, have tried to do in that book and in another one that I'm working on now. But people do criticize him for this rather, perhaps woolliness they would call it, or vagueness, or indeterminacy of description of the content of his ideas. So that would be one quite general weakness, which, as I said, is partly unavoidable, but partly genuine, a genuine fault. I have just one personal favourite, well, I know favourite is quite the word, but there's one personal worry of my own about his ideas, which is something I spend a good deal of time on in the book, which is that I think his pluralist ideas have consequences for our attitude to the main religions of the world, which he's never really willing to follow through to their logical conclusion, and I had a lot of argument with him about that, as reported in the book.
Can you give us some sense of why you have a worry or you had a frustration with the fact that he didn't follow through? What do you think he didn't follow through on?
Well, as I've said, a kind of really fundamental element in his thought is that there can be no one uniquely true moral or political ideology which gets everything right and which all alternatives, which rules out all alternatives, so that it can be, as it were, required of or imposed of everybody. And the main instance he has in mind when he's setting up this view is the totalitarian ideology of the Soviet Union, the oppression visited on Soviet citizens by the Soviet state, the appalling suffering created by Russian communism, which we all know about, from the Stalinist murders of millions of people through to the kind of thought control of their society. So that's what his motivation was. My own motivation comes from a different personal story where I was brought up by religious parents in the way that he wasn't, and I saw in his anti-monism, I saw a very strong argument against any universalist religion which claims to have the right answer to how to live. It seemed to me that exactly the same hostility which he exhibits towards a political authoritarianism should, and for the same reasons, be exhibited towards religious authoritarianism. And I tried to recruit him to my side on this. I tried to get him to agree with me that religious oppression was just another example of exactly the same anti-pluralist oppression which was visible in the Soviet Union and indeed in Nazi Germany and in Cambodia, if you like, and all sorts of other places. But for some reason which I still don't fully understand, which may have to do with biographical reasons, I suppose, for some reason he never 100% agreed with me about this. And I think you'll see from reading in the book that we, to some extent, talked past each other in a way that I never managed to get past, and I regret that I didn't, and I'm sure it was my fault for not taking the right tack. But anyway, we left the subject in a state of some unclarity.
In your book, you say that Berlin had a genius for being human, and that is a startling statement. So can you elaborate what you meant by that?
Yes, perhaps it was only half of what I should have said. I think perhaps I should have had a genius for being human and for understanding humanity. I've said quite a bit already about the second part, about understanding humanity, because of the way he asked the questions and the way he used his reading to throw light on the deepest human questions. But the other part, the part I was referring to as a genius for being human, is just that by being in his presence and hearing him talk, you were made aware of areas of human potential, if you like, which might not otherwise have occurred to you. It's exactly what he himself said about some of the geniuses he met. He said that talking to a genius, perhaps Pasternak, perhaps Akhmatova, perhaps Virginia Woolf, enlarged your sense of what human beings could be and do. Ideas of ways of being human which just wouldn't have occurred to you if you hadn't met somebody like this. So in a way, his life and his conversation demonstrated, if you like, the ways of being human which he elucidated in his work. So he was a kind of, if you like, he was a living example of his theories. You felt when you were talking to him that you were taken up to a level of intellectual competence or inspiration or personal potential which exceeded the normal resting level at which you lived your life. You came out walking on air and feeling excited and inspired and enlarged.
Community, I think perhaps I felt it more strongly than my wife did, who found it very easy and amiable, and quite easy to talk to. But every time he turned to me, I felt I was a little bit under examination, being not grilled but cross-examined about subjects about which I was conceived to know. And I had a feeling, although I may be wrong, that he always, with strangers at least, docketed and labeled them as being experts on this or that, likely to provide interesting or important or at any rate stimulating information about this or that subject, and wished in some way to exploit them, I mean in the best sense of the word, to make use of them, intellectually at least, to the highest advantage, not just to let the conversation dribble in some undirected fashion. And I had a general feeling also that he looked at the world in this sort of way. It was a kind of orange to be squeezed. There were a lot of facts in the world, and a lot of persons, and a lot of events. And the great thing was not to allow oneself to drift along, or to allow oneself even to be passive in the face of them. One hadn't many years to live, and one must do what one can with what one could. One must make use of everything and direct everything, and generally speaking, not so much, I don't think his ambition was to leave his own impress upon life. The idea was to act, always act, never relax, always act. Strive for something, try for something, build something, make something, fail, try again. Endless drive, endless remorseless forward movement.
You also published 4 large volumes of his letters, which are fascinating. Can you say, do you think the letters tell us something about Berlin and his thought that his other works don't?
Yes, I think they add a lot of detail, they add a lot of colour, because he's not, as it were, on his best behaviour in his letters, at least a lot of the time, most of the time. If he's writing to friends, he's more candid, he's more gossipy, his professional guard isn't up. So I think that, yes, I think that if you want to have a full understanding of his own mind and its contents, you certainly will derive a benefit from the letters. I mean, one of the things that comes out from the letters, apart from anything else, is a sense of humour. I mean, if you read the more formal essays that he wrote, you might have give the impression of somebody who's very serious, but actually, I think from the letters you get a truer impression, which is that he loved to laugh, he loved jokes, he loved watching the panoply of human beings of all sorts of idiosyncratic and eccentric kinds, and he revelled in observing and describing their behaviour, which he does brilliantly in the letters. And I think the letters are just terrific fun to read because they are so full of detailed observation of different human beings. He had a favourite phrase, which actually wasn't his own, but it well expresses his attitude, which is "People are my landscape." You know, it was a New Zealand poet, I think, who was once asked, "What kind of landscapes do you like best?" And his reply was, "People are my landscape." And he said, "Entirely true of me," he said. That's what he was an observer of people. And the letters are a kind of extreme example of that, and they're just terribly entertaining.
Berlin died on November the 5th, 1997, at the age of 89. And within a few months of his death, 88, sorry, yes. Within a few months of his death, The Proper Study of Mankind, an anthology of published writings, was published in America. And you took the opportunity to add a postscript to your preface to that edition. So I'd like you maybe to read from that to close this interview.
Since I am writing this only 5 weeks after Isaiah Berlin's death, I shall for a moment allow myself to relax an editor's customary, somewhat formal manner and express the hope that this retrospective anthology of the work he published in his lifetime may now fittingly take on an extra role, to serve as a tribute to a man I loved, a friend who, of the human beings I have known, was not only the most remarkable and delightful, but also, in so many ways, the wisest, the surest in judgment, and the best.
After Berlin died, you continued to work the work of publishing his writings. Can you say something about the nature and scope of those posthumously published works?
Yes, they were of a rather mixed nature, but one dominant element in the books I published after he died was to make transcriptions of extempore lectures available. This was a controversial business because, of course, extempore lectures are much less carefully constructed, they're much less tightly argued. I mean, even when you allow for the looseness, the general looseness of his argumentative style, they are even looser. And there were two main sets of famous lectures which he'd given, which were obvious candidates for conversion into book form. One was the Mellon lectures, which he gave in 1965 in Washington on the origins of romantic thought, or the roots of romanticism, as it was originally called, and is called in the published version. And the other was a series of lectures which he gave in 1952, earlier in fact, 13 years earlier, both in America and on the BBC third programme in England called Freedom and Its Betrayal, which is 6 lectures on key enemies of freedom. Again, an example, if you like, of what we were talking about earlier, about the light to be extracted from looking at hostile critics. And they both had a certain reputation and notoriety or fame attached to them. There were those who thought that such material shouldn't be turned into book form because it lowered the intellectual level in some way. And Bernard Williams was, as I mentioned earlier, one of them. He was had very strong reservations about this. I'm sure he was wrong, and indeed the readers of the books encouraged me to persist in that view, because I think that it's not just that these preserve his thoughts on topics that would otherwise not be among his published work, but that they do so in a way which preserves the liveliness and excitement and engagement of his spoken performance, which I think is well worth doing for its own sake. In fact, if you like, it's a form of publishing pluralism. I mean, you can publish careful work, carefully constructed work, and there's plenty of that among the books of his that I've produced. But also, it's good to have some examples of how he was when he was speaking off the cuff. And I think anybody who reads those two collections will see what I mean, that you have a terrific sense of a mind in full flight, being excited about something, and that conveys itself to you as the reader. There were also some other books, for example, 4 essays on liberty, badly needed to be re-edited because it was full of mistakes of various kinds and didn't have footnotes and various boring things which editors do. So I gathered together a number of other pieces which belonged in the same company and republished the book under the title Liberty, so that all his writings on that issue were within one set of covers, and that's become a kind of absolutely staple textbook as well as book that general readers can read. There were various other bits and pieces that I put together in various ways. One more is perhaps just worth mention, which is a volume of his writings on the politics of the Soviet Union, which weren't generally known. In fact, some of them had originally been published pseudonymously because he didn't want to go on the public record being critical of the Soviet Union, given that he had relatives there and friends who would probably be harassed, at the very least, by the Soviet authorities if he was to publish them openly. And there were people who were against the publication of that book because they thought it was below the standard of his other works. I disagreed, and ultimately there was a conference put together by a man called Strobe Talbot, who used to be the Deputy Secretary of State to Madeleine Albright in the States, and then moved to a think tank in Washington. And so we had a discussion with various Sovietologists of these essays, and that produced a very good opportunity to publish them as a book arising from the conference, which I did. It's called The Soviet Mind, Russian Culture Under Communism, and now in its second edition too. And I think it's a wonderful book, and I think it shows the same kind of insight into the minds. I mean, he in a way, it's the most remarkable empathetic achievement of his, because he gets right inside the minds of the people he's most horrified by, which is the Soviet apparatchiks. And he knows what it's like to be in their minds, and he conveys it. But he doesn't stop hating it all the way through.
You mentioned that in the interview that he came to Ireland. I think at one point you mentioned that. Can you say a little bit about his trip to Ireland and why he was here? And
yes, trips rather than trip. It was in the 1930s. I think it started in 1933. He had a couple of pupils he became close friends with. One was Mary Fisher, who was the daughter of the warden of New College. One was Moira Lind, who was an extremely beautiful Irish girl whose parents were, I think, writers. And one was a Don, ancient history Don, called Christopher Cox, who was at New College, one of the exceptions to his general rule that the New College senior common room was dull. He got on very well. One of them, I'm not sure which, but I fancy it was Christopher Cox, oddly, not the Irish girl, had a friend, a godmother even perhaps, who lived in a place I'm going to mispronounce, Uachtarad. She was called the Countess Metaxa, because she was an Irish lady who had married, I suppose it must be a Greek aristocrat of some kind to end up with a title like that. I haven't informed myself properly on on her origins. At any rate, she was a friend of Christopher Cox's, and she said they wanted to go on holiday together, this foursome, in the long vacation, Oxford long vacation of 1933. And she said to Christopher Cox, well, I own a small island in a lake with a kind of shack on it. Why don't you come and use that? And this is a small island in, again, I shall probably mispronounce this, Loch Anilaun, which is just near Marm Cross in County Galway, to which I have been. And it's a fantastic, remote place that you can only get to in a rowing boat. And there they stayed for several days in 4 successive years. And had a wonderful time, and there are photographs that survive showing them doing this and that, which are great to look at. You will find some of them in the volume called Flourishing, the first volume of letters, and then there's another couple of photographs in the last volume called Affirming, which are in there because he wrote a letter to Moira Lind on her 70th birthday, reminiscing about their wonderful holidays in Ireland together.
I believe you paid a visit to the same destination recently with your own wife.
I did. We have a connection with Clifton on the west coast of Ireland, which is not far from Marm Cross. And because we were going there to see these friends of my wife's, I thought I'd see if I could find this island, which I would love to see the actual place where these holidays had taken place. And of course, I had no idea who owned it or how to get to it. But we went to Loch Anilaun, and parked the car by the road, and noticed that there was a boathouse there. I'd taken a copy with me, a printout of a photograph showing the holidaymakers in the 1930s with a rowing boat, which had given me the clue that obviously the access was by boat. So we went and looked at this boathouse and noticed that the padlock was not secured, which was obviously a mistake by somebody. So cheekily we opened the door and looked inside, and there, standing before me, was the very rowing boat that had appeared in these 1930s photographs. This was another sort of almost like Hartmann-like moment, a kind of piece of time travel, which I hadn't expected to undergo. And that was very exciting. So I wrote a note on the photograph that I had with me, explaining my interest and put it in the boat. And a while later, we had an email from the people who owned the island, an English couple who had bought the island from a local man who claimed that he owned it, although whether he really did was never made clear. And they invited us to go and have lunch with them on the island. So we did that, and the shacks that were there were still the same shacks that had stood there in 1930s and indeed stand there to this day. And the only difference was that the island in the 30s was very bare, rocks and grass, but now it's completely overrun by enormous rhododendron bushes, so that you can wander through tall paths and not see either way. But otherwise, everything is as it was. The shacks are there. The concrete landing jetty, which the early photographs show, is still there in exactly the same form. So that was another magical experience.
Are there any treasures that we have yet to see from the Berlin basement?
Well, there are some things that haven't been published. For one reason or another, there's still quite a lot of unpublished essays, which are in many cases available online, but haven't been collected into volumes. I would do more volumes if I was left to my own devices, but unfortunately I'm one of a number of trustees of Berlin's literary estate, and the other trustees feel that enough has come out now and that the rest should be online and that there shouldn't be further volumes. So at least until their view changes, if it ever does, the online approach is the only one that I can adopt, and that corpus of online essays will continue to grow, although there will be opportunities, I hope, with new editions of the books to add further material, and gradually it may enlarge the published corpus a little bit. There are also some letters which haven't been published, for example, his early letters to Aline, who became his wife, which, of course, I can't publish without the permission of the family, and they feel they're a bit too personal, so for the time being they aren't available. Although they do show a side of him which Aline herself was very anxious to be shown to the world. As a point she often made to me, that he was a very passionate person, and that his letters to her showed that, and that there was a side of him which didn't come out from any of his other writings, and I think she was right about that. Luckily, she did in her lifetime, after initial hesitation, allow us to include in the third volume of his letters the later letters that he wrote to her, the letters that he wrote to her after he was married to her, and those two contain or convey some of the same feeling, although, inevitably it simmered down a bit by then. But she was pleased that in the end that we did that, and so that side of him was on display. Those are the main things that come to mind, but it's an enormous... Oh, and of course, there are hundreds and hundreds of letters that we didn't include in the published volumes. I mean, particularly by the end of the series of volumes, we're publishing less than a quarter of the letters that survive. Now, obviously, some of the letters are less interesting than others, but some of the ones that we didn't include are pretty much as good as the ones we did. We just had to keep the length down. So, again, those are gradually being posted online, and that will continue. And we're making, still finding new letters and new writings that we didn't know about. Just the other day, I suddenly came across a detailed account he'd written of the politics of the world in 1951, covering all parts of the world, which shows an extraordinary range of knowledge and facility to analyse disparate material. That's now online. And we've just found some extra caches of letters. For example, we've recently found the letters he wrote to the editor of the Atlantic Monthly, Edward Weeks, which contains some very interesting letters, and there's been other caches too. So the process goes on, but the vast, basically, what there is there.
You mentioned during the interview, that obviously Isaiah married Aline, who was quite a well-off lady. When you see the photographs, so because he lived in a grand house, which wasn't his own house.
No.
Could you say a little bit about how he met Aline? And
yes, he met the Halbans, as they then were. Aline was then married to her second husband, a physicist named Hans Halban, who was working in Oxford, and I suppose they met socially, concerts and so on. Indeed, he and Aline used to go to concerts a lot on their own. And, they became friends and gradually inclined to be more than friends, I think. And obviously there were problems in the Halbans' own marriage. And eventually things got to the point where a decision had to be made, whether she was going to leave her husband and switch to Isaiah, or whether she was going to grit her teeth and carry on with her existing marriage. And Halban and Berlin had a long conversation once in which Berlin convinced him that by forbidding his wife to see him, she would actually he would actually be increasing the likelihood that she would abandon him, because if you imprison somebody, that increases their desire to get out of the prison. It was a conversation which showed a certain bravery on Berlin's part, which in one way is uncharacteristic of him, and I'd love to have been a fly on the wall at that conversation, because I think he must have been calling on all his reserves of courage. At any rate, Hartmann realized what the situation was, and he then at that point he was offered a new job in Paris, a high-profile physics job. And it's said that he said to Aline, "Well, I'm going to go to Paris, so now this means the decision has to be taken. So, are you going to come to Paris, or are you going to stay with Isaiah? So, is it Paris or Berlin?" Yes, that was the way it was put, and we know what he decided. She decided.
You mentioned Berlin's interest in other thinkers, and a lot of the thinkers he wrote about, well, nearly all of them were historical figures. Were there any philosophers that he particularly admired in his own time?
Yes, I would say that the chief example among his contemporaries was John Austin. He really did admire him enormously. He thought that he talked directly about the subject without, as he put it, having to translate it into a form of technical jargon, without forcing you to use terminology which belonged to him and not to you. He just talked directly about it in a straightforward way. There was a phrase that he used about many thinkers whom he admired, and it was, "There is nothing between him and the object." So many people interpose some kind of ideological preconception or some enormously technical, jargonized system between themselves and whatever it is they're trying to elucidate. And this is a kind of block to clear thought, a kind of fogging of the view, which he really didn't want to see in play, and Austin was a prime example of somebody who didn't do that. So when Austin died prematurely of cancer in 1960, it was a terrible loss of a talent that might have gone on to achieve even greater things.
Interestingly, he thought Austin had a great definition for philosophy, didn't he? He compared philosophy to the sun, and it has this ability to produce light, even though it sheds light at the same time. And he often referred to that as that philosophy has an ability to never stop producing questions that may or may not be answered. Some become answered by science, some become answered by mathematics, but it has this capacity to be almost never-ending.
Yes, he thought that each stage of human thought generated its own problems and questions, and that you couldn't, therefore, aspire to build up a complete list of answers to philosophical questions which would apply for all time and could be read off in all conceivable future situations. He thought the history of philosophy, he described it like a series of parricides that philosophy would shed parts of itself, which would then become independent disciplines, which would then become part of science rather than part of philosophy. It was a parricide, I suppose, because they killed off the relevant part of philosophy before setting up on their own. So psychology, for example, which we referred to earlier, became a fully fledged science as opposed to a part of the philosophy of mind. Logic and mathematics achieved complete independence, and so on. Yes, so philosophy was the questions that were left over, which we couldn't subdivide into these new fields of inquiry. And you might say, well, will a time come when all the contents of philosophy will have been siphoned off into new domains, and there won't be anything left for philosophy to study, and his answer to that would be a clear no, because there are certain kinds of questions, importantly human questions, human moral and political questions, which are of their very nature permanently philosophical, and they will never be subject to an exact science approach, if you like. I mean, he had a view of what the nature of philosophical questions was, which such questions are very good examples of. He divided questions into three categories. There were empirical questions where you could answer them clearly, at least in principle, by examining the world or doing experiments of some kind. How many miles is it to New York? You measure it. At what age did President Kennedy die? You look up the sources. Those are empirical questions. Then there are formal questions, which are to do with systems which we create ourselves, such as logic and mathematics, but also his examples were heraldry and chess, so that if you want to see how a king moves in chess, you look at the rules which we created. You don't watch the behavior of a king on a chessboard. I mean, if somebody says to you, well, last Tuesday I saw a king move 3 squares at once, that doesn't tell you something about the rules of chess. It tells you about somebody who doesn't know the rules of chess. It's a different sort of question. And then in between these two, or in addition to these two, there was the philosophical question, the question we don't quite know how to answer, where there's no technique, no clear technique of answering it. We can't examine the world. We can't examine a formal system. They're queer questions. An example he gives in an interview with Brian McGee is, why can't I go back and meet Napoleon? Why can't I go back in time? That would be a philosophical question par excellence. And a lot of the central moral and political questions that every human being has to face at some level, in some form in their life, belong clearly in that third category, that third basket of philosophical questions.
And interestingly, he talks, a lot of us stop asking these questions at some point because we think we become commonsensical or whatever, which is why he often compared these questions to what he called childlike questions.
Yes, he did. And I think that's an important thing. I think, if you like, he was in that way a great child himself. He never lost the capacity to be absorbed by, mesmerized by deep philosophical questions. And he says in the discussion I referred to with Brian McGee, he said most people don't want to ask or consider these questions. Most grown-ups don't want to. They say, oh, don't bother me with that, just go and climb a tree or whatever. And gradually, of course, most children, as they grow up, are conditioned into not asking these questions anymore, into forgetting about them, not bothering with them. More's the pity, he says. Those who are not so conditioned become philosophers.
Which actually brings us back to Boston, who I think said that neither be all nor an end all be, which is a lovely epitaph for philosophy. It's that ever-questioning spirit.
Yes, it's also a pluralist slogan, if you like, because it's against the construction of final answers and unique systems which are imposed from above. Very sweetly, Austin said he dreamt it. It's a version of neither a borrower nor a lender be. But it just must have occurred to him in the still watches of the night.
You spent most of your professional life being an editor, which a lot of people would think is
bizarre.
It's you don't get much glory, although you have with your new book in a very explicit way, and those who understand editing know what a wonderful job you've done. But what are the attractions of editing for you?
Goodness. Difficult to say. I mean, that requires a kind of psychoanalytic self-knowledge, which I probably lack. Part of it is simply a certain obsessiveness, natural obsessiveness of personality, an enjoyment of imposing order on chaos, a kind of very un-Berlinian, if you like, drive to tidy up something, to tidy up some aspect of the world. But in the case of Berlin, I think by far the strongest motivation is the knowledge that he needed an editor. I mean, it became plain that he was never himself going to put his work together and publish it in volumes so that it was easily accessible to readers, and it needed an editor to do it, and it certainly called on that type of tidying and systematizing activity which I've just referred to, but it also called on a lot of detective-like work, particularly in tracking down ostensible quotations to their sources and giving proper footnote references to them. And that too is something which I just have a natural taste for. I mean, to find a quotation which Berlin uses but never attributes correctly and probably gets wrong, it's the thrill of the chase, if you like, of that particular kind. A lot of his quotations, of course, are from foreign originals, in particular Russian originals. And they're just short phrases that he plucks out of somewhere and remembers. And it's very, very difficult to find them.
So I think Berlin has got the editor he deserved. I'm not so sure if he's got the life he deserves yet.
No, probably not. I mean, I don't want to denigrate Michael's book at all. I think it was a terrific achievement, and it was brought out within a year of his death, and it was the closest thing we'll ever have to an authorized biography of him. And it was based very closely on a series of mostly recorded conversations over a period of 10 years. So if you like, it's a covert autobiography because it presents Berlin in the light and from the angle that he would have chosen himself, although he always said that he wasn't sufficiently interested in himself to write a biography. I don't think that's entirely true. I think he was much more interested in himself than he liked to admit, but he was too idle to write a biography, probably. I mean, that's an oversimplification in itself, but I have a certain skepticism about his declaration on that point. But since I should add actually at this point that Michael also very diligently read vast quantities of Berlin's correspondence and made quite a lot of use of them in the book. But this was at a stage when the papers had not been systematized and catalogued in the way that they subsequently were by the Bodleian Library in Oxford. So possibly there might be more to be gleaned from them now than there was then. Not sure how big a factor that is. But I'm sure that there are more than one alternative lives that could be written. One particular one would be what you might call an intellectual biography, which would be a study of his ideas as they developed through his life. There's a certain amount of that in John Gray's book, but really that book and other accounts of his ideas tend to treat his body of work as somehow static, as something which came into being all at one time rather than developing. But there have been subsequent books, one by Joshua Chernes, for example, which take a historical view of his early political thought and its development. And if you like, they do a Berlin to the study of Berlin. They treat it historically rather than analytically. And I think that's a productive line to take. So there could, I think, be a book that went through his whole life, relating his ideas to his life. That would be a possibility, and there is one possible such book in the pipeline, I understand, from somebody who has a form of writer's block, so it might be some time before it appears. And one could imagine a much more detailed biography, which just was twice as long as Ignatiev's and went into a lot more detail. and also was written possibly from a more objective viewpoint. It was perhaps more critical than Ignatieff was, or indeed sought to be. But it's it's another example of pluralism. I mean, I think there are many possible books, all of which have their value. There was a remark of Berlin's which applies here, which is one of my favorite remarks of his, when he was talking about the famous confusion between Irving Berlin and Isaiah Berlin on the part of Winston Churchill in 1944. And he used to say, there are many versions of this story, all true. And I think the same way one might say there are many biographies of Isaiah Berlin, all true.
The last question I'd like to ask you is, you mentioned you are working on a book at the moment on Berlin. Can you say a little bit more, a preview of what that's going to be on?
Yes, it's called Isaiah Berlin in Brief, a critical introduction. At least it's called that at the moment. Goodness knows what it'll end up being called. My idea was to write a past master type book on Berlin, because I thought he himself was an appropriate subject for the series which he'd inspired me to create. And indeed, I began by offering such a book to OUP, thinking they might like to include it in their very short introduction series, the one that emerged from Past Masters. Unfortunately, though, they declined even to look at the outline which I had written, on the grounds that they were not currently commissioning new studies of individual thinkers for the series. I am slightly sceptical about whether that was the real reason, but whatever it was, obviously it can't therefore take that form and will be published by Princeton instead as a freestanding book, although I think related in design and production to the series of volumes of Berlin's own works that they publish. The idea is that there isn't a short, really accessible account of Berlin's ideas which a general reader who wants a brief guide can look at. There are very good books, but they're longer or slightly more difficult to read. And in a way, part of my aim is to write an essay about Berlin's ideas of the same kind that Berlin might have written if he himself had been his own subject. To aspire to, I mean, that's a very tall order, but to aspire to that level of accessibility and clarity. But I don't want it to be entirely descriptive, not just a summary of what he said, because I think that's less interesting than an account that engages with some of the difficulties and problems of his thought. That's why I've subtitled it a critical introduction. So whether I'll pull it off is another matter altogether, but there is no such book of that kind at the moment. And there is this problem in general in talking about or Berlin or explaining to people why it was important, which is that his corpus of work is so luxuriant, so detailed, so various, so rich, that you can't sum it up in one proposition or even a series of propositions. You know, you can say that Einstein discovered relativity, for example. You know, I don't think that you can say a similar thing about Berlin. I mean, you can say he was a liberal, and you can say he was a pluralist. That's the closest you can get to it. But the gap between saying that and a full engagement with the whole glory of his work is enormous. And I'd like to sort of bridge that gap a little bit and give if you like, a bluffer's guide to why Berlin matters, why Berlin is important.
So the result of Romanticism is liberalism, toleration, decency, and the appreciation of the imperfections of life. Some degree of increased, if you like, rational self-understanding. This certainly was very, very far from the intentions of Romanticism. But at the same time, so far as Romantic doctrine is true, they are the persons who most strongly emphasize the unpredictability of all human activities. And in their own particular case, they are hoisted their own petard. Aiming at one thing, they produced, fortunately for us all, almost the exact opposite. Thank you very much. I'm most grateful to you for having had the patience to listen to these 6 long lectures.